The night Sadie Sawyer arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, the temperature dropped so suddenly and so cruelly that even the horses pressed their flanks together for warmth, and she stood on the wooden platform of the train depot with nothing but a carpetbag, a broken heart tucked beneath her ribs, and the absolute certainty that she had made either the bravest or the most foolish decision of her 24 years on this earth. It was October of 1878, and the plains of southern Kansas did not forgive a person for being unprepared. The wind came off the open grassland like a living thing, something with teeth and intent, and it found every gap in Sadie's wool traveling coat with what felt like personal enthusiasm. She clutched the lapels together with one hand and squinted through the darkness at the town that spread out before her, its main street lit by a handful of oil lanterns that swung and guttered in the gusting air. She had come from Missouri. She had come from a man named Gerald Holt, who had promised her a life and a home, and then, 3 weeks before their wedding day, had quietly married the daughter of the bank president instead. She had come from her mother's tearful face and her father's stiff silence and her 2 younger sisters who looked at her with a mixture of pity and relief that she found almost harder to bear than the humiliation itself. She had come from all of that, from every bit of it, and she had gotten on a train headed west because she had seen an advertisement in the Kansas City Star that read, "Schoolteacher needed. Caldwell, Kansas. Steady wages. Room and board provided. Apply in person or by letter to Mayor Elias Grundy." She had applied by letter. She had received a reply. She had packed her bag and she had not looked back, or at least she had tried very hard not to, which was a different thing entirely, but close enough for a woman who was determined to rebuild herself from whatever pieces remained. The depot agent, a small red-faced man named Chester who smelled powerfully of tobacco and had the look of someone who had not been surprised by anything in 30 years, pointed her toward the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Clara Hatch, 2 blocks north and 1 block east. "You cannot miss it," he said. "It has the blue curtains in the windows, only place in town with blue curtains. Mrs. Hatch is very proud of those curtains." Sadie thanked him and walked out into the dark and the cold. She found the blue curtains without difficulty. She knocked. Mrs. Hatch answered the door in a nightcap and a quilted robe, and looked at Sadie with the particular expression of a woman who was accustomed to being woken at odd hours, and had decided long ago that irritation was a waste of energy. She was somewhere between 50 and 70, with silver hair and sharp brown eyes and hands that were rough from years of genuine work. "You must be the new schoolteacher," Mrs. Hatch said. It was not a question. "Sadie Sawyer," Sadie confirmed. "I am very sorry about the hour." "The train doesn't care what hour it is, Mrs. Hatch said philosophically, and opened the door wider to let her in. The room was small but clean, with an iron-framed bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the narrow alley between the boarding house and the general store next door. There was a small fireplace in the corner, and Mrs. Hatch built it up with practiced efficiency, and then she left Sadie alone with a candle and the sound of the wind pressing itself against the glass. Sadie sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands for a long moment. Then she opened her carpetbag and took out her teaching books and her extra dress and the small framed photograph of her grandmother that she carried everywhere, and she arranged these things around the room until it felt slightly less like a place she did not belong. She was asleep before the candle burned down to half. The school was a single-room building at the east end of town, sturdy enough against the weather but drafty in the corners where the boards had warped. There were 14 children enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 13, and they arrived on the first morning in varying states of cleanliness and enthusiasm, some clutching slates, some still chewing their breakfast, all of them sizing her up with the frank and merciless assessment that only children can deliver without any social filter whatsoever. Sadie had been trained as a teacher. She had spent 2 years studying in a normal school in St. Louis, and she knew her arithmetic and her grammar and her history, and she was not afraid of a room full of children, even one that smelled of mud and livestock and the particular sweetness of unwashed wool. She wrote her name on the board in clear letters. She told them what she expected. She told them that she believed every one of them was capable of learning something remarkable, and she meant it, which is the thing that children can always tell. By the end of the first week, she had their trust, which was more than she had managed with most adults lately, and that felt like enough of a foundation to build on. The town of Caldwell itself was rough in the way that cattle towns were rough in the late 1870s. It sat right at the Kansas border, just north of Indian Territory, and the Texas cattle drives came through it on the Kishom Trail in the warmer months, bringing with them the particular energy of men who had been living hard for months and had money in their pockets and nowhere sensible to spend it. By October, the drive season was winding down, but there were still cowboys drifting through, and the saloons on Texas Street did brisk business, and the town marshal, a lean, serious man named Dahlin, walked his rounds with the unhurried competence of someone who had seen everything at least twice. Sadie kept to herself during those first weeks. She ate her meals at Mrs. Hatch's table, she taught her school, she graded her papers by lamplight in the evenings, and she wrote careful, cheerful letters home to her mother that were almost entirely true. She was finding her footing. That was the honest description of it. She was a woman who had been knocked sideways and was in the slow, determined process of righting herself, and it took concentration, and it did not leave much room for anything else. She noticed Abraham Atkins for the first time on a Tuesday, which she would remember later as an odd detail, the specific day of the week, but she would always remember it. She was walking back from the general store with a small parcel of chalk and a few sheets of heavy paper for the school, and she turned the corner near the livery stable, and he was standing in the yard there, working with a horse that was clearly unhappy about something, and doing it with a kind of patient steadiness that was so total it stopped her feet without her meaning to stop them. He was tall, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that was set with concentration rather than hardness. He was speaking to the horse in a low, steady voice, not making any sudden moves, just standing at an angle to the animal and letting it get used to his presence. And after a moment the horse blew out a long breath and dropped its head, and the tension in its whole body changed. It was a small thing and also a significant one, and Sadie watched it happen and felt something she could not immediately name shift in the general region of her chest. He looked up and saw her watching. She felt her face go warm and started walking again, which was the sensible response. She asked Mrs. Hatch about him that evening, as casually as she could manage over the plate of salt pork and beans that constituted Tuesday's supper. Abraham Atkins, Mrs. Hatch said, without any particular emphasis. He works out at the Rocking H Ranch, has done for a few years now. Good worker, quiet. He comes into town for supplies and such. His family had a homestead up near Wichita, but that went bad some years back, I understand. He keeps to himself mostly. He seems capable with horses, Sadie said. He is, Mrs. Hatch agreed and poured herself more coffee and did not look up, which meant either that she had noticed nothing or that she had noticed everything and was keeping her own counsel. And with Mrs. Hatch, it was genuinely difficult to tell. It was 3 days after that conversation, on a Friday evening when the first real cold snap of the autumn came rolling down from the north with serious intent, that Sadie came home from an evening of grading papers at the school to find something on the floor outside her door at the boarding house. A blanket. Folded neat and square, thick wool in a dark red plaid pattern, the kind of substantial, well-made blanket that meant someone had given thought to both warmth and durability. It was not her blanket. She owned one thin quilt that Mrs. Hatch had provided with the room, and which was adequate for mild weather and distinctly inadequate for what the Kansas plains could do in October. She looked up and down the narrow hallway. There was no one there. The boarding house was quiet, with only the sound of the wind outside and the distant murmur of voices from Mrs. Hatch's sitting room downstairs. There was no note. There was nothing to indicate where the blanket had come from or who had put it there. Sadie picked it up. It was wonderfully heavy in her arms, the kind of weight that promised genuine warmth, and she could feel already from the texture of it that it was good quality wool, not the scratchy cheap kind, but something with a lanolin softness to it that meant it had been made with care, or at least purchased with more than casual thought. She carried it inside and spread it over her bed on top of the thin quilt, and that night she slept warmer than she had since arriving in Caldwell, and she told herself she would find out in the morning who had left it and return it with proper thanks. In the morning, the question felt less urgent. She asked Mrs. Hatch whether anyone had left anything for her, and Mrs. Hatch said she had not seen anyone, which was not quite a denial and not quite a confirmation, just a statement of what she had personally observed or chosen to observe. Sadie mentioned it to no one else that day and told herself she would get to the bottom of it eventually. The following Friday, another blanket appeared. This one was a deep blue, also wool, also folded neatly, also with no note and no sign of who had placed it there. Sadie now had 2 blankets on her bed and was genuinely the warmest she had been all autumn, and she stood in the hallway holding the blue one and felt something unfamiliar move through her. Not quite embarrassment and not quite pleasure, but something in between, something warm that had nothing to do with the wool in her hands. She thought about the man she had seen with the horse. She pushed the thought away. The 3rd blanket arrived the following Friday. This one was cream-colored with a pattern of dark stripes, and it was even finer than the first 2, and Sadie sat on the edge of her bed holding it and made the genuine decision that she needed to find out what was happening, except that she was not entirely sure she wanted to know, which was a different and considerably more complicated situation than simply being ignorant of the facts. She was not, she told herself firmly, a woman who needed to be taken care of. She had come west precisely to demonstrate that she was capable of taking care of herself. She was a schoolteacher. She had a wage and a room and a purpose and 14 children who were learning their letters and their sums and the general shape of how the world worked, and she did not need mysterious blankets appearing outside her door to make her feel that she mattered. And yet, the blankets kept coming. Every Friday without fail. And then after the 3rd week it was not only Fridays, it was sometimes also on cold midweek nights when the temperature dropped sharply, and she would come home from the school to find a folded square of warmth waiting for her, and whoever was doing it timed it perfectly. There was never anyone in the hallway. She never caught so much as a shadow or a footfall. October turned toward November and the plains of Kansas settled into their winter character, which was serious and gray and not inclined toward mercy. The cattle drives had ended for the season. Many of the seasonal workers who followed the drives had drifted south toward Texas for the winter, and the town of Caldwell pulled itself in slightly, the way a turtle adjusts to the temperature, and settled into the quieter rhythms of the cold months. The school continued. Sadie's 14 students had grown into something she could genuinely call a community of young learners, which was as proud a thing as she had to show for herself just then, and she was proud of it accordingly. Tommy Brecker, who was 11 and had the attention span of a grasshopper in summer, had produced a page of long division that was not only correct but carefully done, and she had put it at the top of the stack, with a warmth she tried not to let show too much on her face, because Tommy was at the age where public praise from a teacher was a complicated gift. She had also become more friendly with some of the townspeople. Elias Grundy, the mayor, was a fussy but fundamentally decent man who paid her wages without complaint and occasionally stopped by the school to observe, and then told her she was doing an excellent job in the tone of a man who had not expected her to do an excellent job, and was faintly surprised to be wrong. There was Martha Kellens at the dry goods store who had 3 children in the school and had begun stopping Sadie in the street to report on their progress at home, which Sadie found both touching and occasionally exhausting. There was the marshal who tipped his hat to her every morning when their paths crossed on the main street, which they did reliably because he did his morning rounds at 7 and she walked to the school at 7:15 and they always passed each other in front of the bank. And there was, at the periphery of her awareness, Abraham Atkins. She saw him perhaps twice a week at most. He came to town from the Rocking H for supplies, or she passed the livery when he was there. He was always working when she saw him, or moving with the purposeful quiet of a man who knew what he needed to do and was doing it, and he always acknowledged her when their eyes met. A nod, sometimes a touch of his hat brim, never anything presumptuous, never anything that could be called forward. He was the least forward man she had ever encountered, which, given that she had grown up around Missouri farmers who treated small talk like a competitive sport, was a quality she found restful. One afternoon in early November, she was at the general store picking up ink for the school, and he came in behind her, and they stood next to each other at the counter for a moment while old Mr. Prater rummaged for the correct bottle, and Abraham said, without turning to look at her directly, "The weather is changing tonight. It'll be cold." "Is it?" she said, which was not the most sparkling response, but she had been caught slightly off guard by the directness of him speaking to her at all. "Yes," he said, and that was all, and then he asked Mr. Prater for his supplies and paid and carried them out, and Sadie stood with her ink and thought about the warmth of wool. That night there was a blanket outside her door. This one was a dark forest green, heavier than all the others, and folded with the same neat precision as every one before it, and Sadie stood holding it in the cold hallway and felt something crack open in her chest like ice breaking on a spring river, slow and inevitable and impossible to stop once it had started. She went downstairs and found Mrs. Hatch in the kitchen, the only truly warm room in the house in November, and she sat down at the table and said, "Mrs. Hatch, I need to know something." Mrs. Hatch poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her and waited, which was one of her finest qualities. "Has anyone been coming to the house in the evenings?" Sadie asked. "On a regular basis. Anyone at all?" Mrs. Hatch wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the far wall for a moment in the way of someone conducting an internal consultation about how much to say. "I believe," she said carefully, "that I have heard boots on the porch steps on certain evenings. And I am a woman who values privacy," Mrs. Hatch said, "and I run a boarding house, and people who come in from outside on a cold night and leave again without disturbing anyone are not my particular concern." "Mrs. Hatch." The older woman met her eyes. There was something in her expression that was not quite a smile and not quite tenderness, and was perhaps both at once. "I could not say for certain," she said. "I am not in the habit of spying on my boarders or their visitors, but if you were to find out the answer for yourself, I don't imagine you'd have to look very far." Sadie sat with that for a moment. "He's a good man," Mrs. Hatch said quietly to her coffee cup. "Whatever that's worth to you." Sadie went upstairs and added the green blanket to the collection on her bed, which now constituted a remarkable quantity of warmth, and lay there in the dark listening to the wind and thinking about a tall, quiet man who had told her the weather was changing and then made sure she would not feel it. She made her decision the next morning. The following Tuesday she was at the livery, which was not on her usual route to anywhere, but she had told herself she needed to look at something in that direction, and it was not entirely a lie. Abraham was in the yard, as she had half expected he might be, working on a piece of harness with the focused patience that seemed to be his native mode of operating in the world. She walked up to the fence and stopped. He looked up and looked at her and waited. "Mr. Atkins," she said. "Miss Sawyer," he said. "I have been finding blankets outside my door," she said, "for a month now, perhaps longer." He did not say anything. He held the harness in both hands and looked at her steadily. "I have been wondering," she said, "who might have put them there." There was a pause. The wind moved across the yard between them, cold and direct, and a horse in the near stall shifted its weight and blew. "I imagine," Abraham said, "it was someone who noticed you were cold." "Is that right?" Sadie said. "The boarding house walls are thin," he said, "and October came in hard this year." She looked at him. He looked back at her. His eyes were the color of winter sky just before the light went entirely, a blue that was not quite gray, patient and serious and entirely without performance. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, as if he were considering whether the question deserved an honest answer or a careful one, and deciding on the former. "I wasn't sure you'd want to know," he said. "Some people find it easier to accept a kindness if they don't know the source of it." Sadie felt something move through her that she did not immediately have a name for, but that settled in her chest with the weight of something genuine and unretractable. "That is," she said slowly, "either the most thoughtful thing I have ever heard or the most puzzling." "Probably both," he said, with a gravity that took her a moment to realize was humor. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came out before she could organize it into something more composed, and it was a real one, not the careful social variety she had been deploying for months. Abraham watched her laugh, and something happened in his face, very subtle, a shift around the eyes that was not quite a smile but was what happened to a person before one. "Thank you," she said when she had collected herself. "For the blankets, truly. I have been warmer than I have any right to be." "You have every right to be warm," he said simply. She walked home thinking about that sentence for so long that she almost missed her turn and ended up at the edge of Texas Street before she noticed. After that, things between them changed in the way that things change when two people have acknowledged something true out loud, which is to say that they did not change dramatically all at once, because neither Abraham nor Sadie was a dramatic person, but they changed in accumulating small ways that added up to something substantial. He began to stop and talk to her when their paths crossed, and she found that she arranged her paths to cross his with somewhat greater frequency than pure chance would explain. Their conversations were not long, especially at first, but they were honest, which was something she had come to value above almost everything else after a year of being politely lied to in Missouri. He did not say things he did not mean, and he did not mean things he did not say. And with a woman who had spent significant emotional energy on a man who had been able to do both simultaneously, this quality in Abraham felt like something close to miraculous. She learned things about him slowly, the way you learn the landscape of a place you are coming to love, by walking it repeatedly and paying attention. His family had come west from Ohio when he was 12, his father with plans for a homestead and his mother with a trunk full of books that she had refused to leave behind. The homestead north of Wichita had gone badly in the drought years, and his father had died of pneumonia the winter after the crops failed, and his mother had gone to live with her sister in Missouri, and Abraham had stayed on in Kansas, because by then it felt more like home than anywhere else. He was 28 years old. He had been riding and working cattle ranches since he was 15, which meant he had more experience of the physical world than almost anyone she knew, and a certain philosophical relationship with hardship that came not from pretending things were fine, but from finding what was genuinely good in a situation and leaning into it with his whole weight. "Do you miss your mother?" she asked him once when they were walking together in the late afternoon, which had become something that happened when the circumstances arranged themselves correctly, which they had begun to do with suspicious regularity. "Every day," he said, "but she writes. She is well." "My mother writes too," Sadie said. "She is trying to be glad that I have come here. She is not quite there yet." "She will be," Abraham said with a certainty that made Sadie look at him sideways. "How do you know?" "Because you're all right," he said. "She will see it eventually." She thought about that for a long time after. November deepened and settled into itself, and the blankets continued, though now when they appeared outside her door they were not entirely mysterious. They were instead a kind of ongoing conversation in wool, something that said without words that she was thought of, that someone's attention turned toward her in the evenings, and she had begun to look forward to them with a feeling she understood well enough but was not quite ready to name. Abraham was still working at the rocking age, riding out with the other ranch hands to move the cattle to the winter pastures, mending fences, doing all the necessary unglamorous work of keeping a cattle operation running through the cold months. He came to town less often in December than he had in the autumn, but when he came he found her, or she found him, or they found each other in the ordinary way of two people who have quietly become the most interesting part of each other's daily landscape. There was a Christmas gathering organized by the church, which was the social event of the winter season in Caldwell, and attended by everyone who was not specifically opposed to Christmas or to other people. Mrs. Hatch went and took Sadie with her, and half the town showed up in their best clothes, and there was punch and pie, and a fiddle player from over near Medicine Lodge who played reels fast enough to make your feet move without your permission. Abraham was there. Sadie saw him across the room when she came in, standing with two other men from the rocking H near the far wall, and he saw her at the same moment, and they had by now developed the capacity to communicate certain things across a distance with simple eye contact, which was in itself a kind of intimacy that she had not catalogued until she felt the warmth of it landing in her chest. He crossed the room to her with the unhurried deliberateness that was entirely his, and he said, "Miss Sawyer," and she said, "Mr. Atkins," and they both understood that they were being slightly formal for the benefit of the room and that it had a quality of gentle comedy to it. "Will you dance?" he asked. She would dance. She had not danced since Missouri and had missed it more than she had admitted to herself, and she put her hand in his, and they joined the set that was forming on the cleared floor, and the fiddle player launched into something fast and bright that required more concentration than conversation, and this turned out to be exactly right, because it gave them space to simply be next to each other without needing to manage it with words. He danced well. Not elaborately, not showingly, but with the same physical attentiveness he brought to everything, aware of where she was, moving to accommodate her, easy and sure. His hand at her back when they moved through the turns was steady and there, and not insistent, exactly there and no more than there, and she found herself thinking that this was what it felt like to be handled with genuine respect by someone who actually wanted to be where he was. They danced 2 dances and then stepped back to the edge of the floor and found themselves pressed slightly together by the crowd that was filling in around them, and in that proximity there was the particular awareness of warmth and nearness that preceded so many significant things. "I have been wanting to ask you something," Abraham said. "Then ask," she said. "Would you come to supper with me?" he said. Not at the boarding house, at the restaurant on First Street. He said it straightforwardly, without nerves that she could see, but she knew him well enough by now to understand that the steadiness of his manner was not the same as the absence of feeling. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." They went the following Saturday. The restaurant on First Street was modest but respectable, with tablecloths and actual napkins, and a menu that featured things other than beans, and they sat across from each other, and for the first time had the formal experience of a meal that was explicitly about spending time together rather than happening to be in the same place. It was wonderful. She had not expected quite how wonderful it would be, perhaps because she had been trying to manage her expectations carefully after what had happened in Missouri. But there was something about sitting across a table from Abraham Atkins in good light, and talking without any agenda other than knowing him better that made her feel, for the first time in nearly a year, entirely and genuinely like herself. They talked about Kansas. They talked about Ohio and Missouri, the places they had come from and why they had left. He told her about his mother's books, the ones that had made the journey west in the trunk, a collection that included Shakespeare and a natural history of the North American continent and a well-worn Bible, and inexplicably, a French novel that his mother had never explained, and that Abraham had read at 14 with considerable bewilderment and lasting affection. Sadie laughed until she had to put down her fork. She told him about the normal school in St. Louis, about the 2 years of study and how much she had loved learning the theory of teaching, how to reach a child who was struggling, how to challenge one who was bored, the particular satisfaction of watching understanding arrive in someone's face like a lamp being lit from the inside. "You love it," he said, not a question. "Teaching, yes, I do." "That's a good thing," he said, "to love what you do." "Do you love ranching?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "I love horses," he said. "I love the land." The work itself is hard and sometimes cold and sometimes genuinely terrible, but there's a piece of it that I wouldn't trade." He paused. "Being out in the open. Having quiet when I need it. That part." "You need quiet," she said, understanding him. "I do," he said. "I grew up with a mother who understood that and a father who did not, and that tells you something about which of them shaped me more." He said it without bitterness, just with the clarity of a man who had had time to see his own history honestly. She reached across the table and touched his hand, just for a moment, just a light pressure of fingertips on the back of his hand. And he looked down at where she had touched and then up at her face. And what was in his expression then was something so undefended and so genuine that she felt it like a physical impact, warmth spreading up from her chest into her throat. They walked back along the main street in the dark, in the cold December air, their breath making small clouds, and at the door of the boarding house he stopped and faced her, and the lamplight from the window fell across one side of his face and left the other in shadow. And she thought, not for the first time, that he was a beautiful man in the particular way that the West made people beautiful, with honesty rather than artifice. With the kind of face that knew what weather and work and genuine feeling looked like and showed evidence of all three. "Sadie," he said. And it was the first time he had used her given name, and it sounded like something being placed carefully in a place where it would be safe. "Abraham," she said. "I am not a man with a lot of words," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that. I am better at doing than saying." "I have noticed," she said softly. "But I want to say," he said, "that this has been the best evening I can remember in a long time. I want you to know that." "Me too," she said. He nodded once. He touched the brim of his hat. He turned and walked away into the dark, and she went inside and climbed the stairs and found, outside her door, a blanket she had not seen before, a warm amber brown with a pattern that was unlike any of the others, and she pressed her face into it for a moment before carrying it inside. And it smelled faintly of horse and hay and wood smoke, and something she could not name, but was rapidly coming to identify as simply him. January in Caldwell was not for the faint of heart. The temperature fell hard in the first week and stayed there, and the wind off the plains found new and creative ways to make itself felt through every gap in every wall and window frame in town. Sadie's school continued because she was not inclined to give the weather the satisfaction of stopping it, and her students arrived red-cheeked and stamping snow from their boots, and were, if anything, more attentive than usual because moving around was not appealing and sitting near the schoolroom stove was. The collection of blankets on Sadie's bed had become something of an institution within the boarding house. Mrs. Hatch never commented on them directly, but she had taken to leaving a small mug of hot tea outside Sadie's door on particularly cold evenings, which was her own way of participating in the general project of keeping one person warm. Abraham came to town twice a week when the weather allowed. He and Sadie had settled into the easy regularity of people who have agreed, without discussing it in so many words, that they are in each other's lives now and have no immediate intention of changing that. They walked when the weather permitted. They had supper together at the restaurant on first Saturdays. They talked in front of the general store or the livery whenever circumstance put them both there at the same time. What they did not do was say, clearly and directly, what this was. This was not evasion, and it was not cowardice on either of their parts. It was more that neither of them was in a hurry, both of them having learned in different ways the cost of moving too fast on the strength of feelings that had not yet fully proved themselves. Abraham because he was by nature a patient man who had learned to trust in the long, steady revelation of things. Sadie because she had been hurt before and was moving carefully, not from fear exactly but from the particular caution of someone who has learned to verify what she thinks she knows. But the feeling was growing. It was growing in the way that things grow in winter, under the surface, invisible and determined, building towards something that would eventually push through into light regardless. It was a Wednesday in the second week of January when things shifted again. Sadie was walking back from the school in the late afternoon, the light already going from the sky with the swift indifference of winter in Kansas. And she turned the corner near the post office and nearly walked directly into a man she did not know. Someone tall and broad and smelling of whiskey and several days of unwashed travel, who looked at her with the particular disregard of a person who considers women primarily as objects of amusement or inconvenience. "Well now," he said, and his voice had the slow drawl of someone who was drunk enough to have lost his better judgment but not drunk enough to have lost his feet. "Excuse me," Sadie said, moving to go around him. He moved to block her path. It was done lazily, without any particular urgency, the kind of movement that said he did this routinely and routinely got away with it. "Excuse you," he said, with a smile that did not involve any part of his face above the teeth. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" "I am going home," Sadie said, very clearly and without any warmth in her voice, "and I would appreciate you moving out of my way." "I don't think I will," he said pleasantly. Sadie was not a woman who frightened easily, but she was alone on a street that was in the process of emptying as the cold drove people indoors, and the nearest person she could see was a figure half a block away who had their back turned, and she was doing the rapid mental calculation of whether to push past him directly or call out, or simply stand her ground with sufficient confidence that he decided she was more trouble than she was worth. And then Abraham was there. She did not know where he had come from. She had not seen him in the street a moment before. He was simply suddenly present at her shoulder with the particular quality of stillness that she had come to understand was not the absence of intensity but its exact opposite. "Move on," Abraham said to the man. That was all. 2 words in a voice that was quiet and completely level, with nothing performative about it, nothing designed to impress or intimidate, just a statement of what was going to happen next. The man looked at Abraham and clearly did his own rapid calculation. Abraham was not a larger man than he was, and he was not armed in any visible way, and yet there was something in his bearing that communicated clearly that he was not in the business of bluffing. The man moved on. He muttered something Sadie chose not to hear and shuffled off toward Texas Street, and the moment was over. Sadie let out a breath she had been holding with more care than was probably visible. "I was managing," she said. "I know," Abraham said. "I didn't need rescuing." "I know that too," he said quietly. "I didn't do it because you couldn't manage. I did it because I didn't want you to have to." She looked at him for a moment in the gray winter light. There was something in her chest that was now reaching the point where not naming it had become more effortful than naming it would be. "Walk me home," she said. "Yes," he said. They walked in silence for a little while, which between them was not uncomfortable silence, but the kind that was full of things they were both thinking and neither was rushing. The cold was serious and settling in for the evening, and their boots made quiet sounds on the frozen ground. "Abraham," she said. "Yes." "Why did you start with the blankets?" she asked. "How did you know I was cold?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. "Mrs. Hatch mentioned to the blacksmith that her new boarder was finding the room drafty," he said. "Word travels in a small town." "It does," Sadie agreed. "And I saw you once," he said, "walking back from the school in the evening, and you had your arms wrapped around yourself and your coat was thin and you looked—" He stopped for a moment. "I don't know, cold, but also as if you were very much in the business of not looking cold, as if you wouldn't ask for anything." "I wouldn't have," Sadie said, and felt the truth of it. "I know," he said. "That's why I didn't ask." She stopped walking. He stopped too and looked at her, and the lamplight from the nearest window fell across the snow between them and made everything soft and slightly unreal. "I need to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "I came here from a situation that—" She hesitated, organizing it. "There was a man in Missouri. We were engaged. He left me for someone else, and I came west because I couldn't stay there and watch everyone feel sorry for me." She said it plainly, without drama, but with the precision of someone who has finally decided to say the whole true thing. "I have been careful since I got here. I have been very deliberate about not letting my feelings move faster than my good sense." "That's wise," Abraham said. "It has been wise," she said, "but it has also been exhausting," and I think she took a breath. "I think I am going to stop being quite so careful where you are concerned." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I think that's the best thing anyone has said to me in a long time." "Do not make me regret it," she said, but she said it smiling. "I won't," he said, and the simplicity of it was more convincing than anything elaborate could have been. He walked her to the door of the boarding house and they stood in the cold and he took her hand in both of his, a deliberate thing, not casual at all, and the warmth of his hands was the most immediate and practical warmth she had felt in months, and also absolutely not only practical. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if that's acceptable to you." "It is acceptable to me," she said. He smiled then, the full version of it that she had seen the beginnings of before but not the whole thing, and it transformed his face in a way that made her feel briefly dizzy, as though the ground had shifted slightly under her boots. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, an old-fashioned gesture that she would not have expected from a ranch hand, and that somehow from him was entirely right. Then he walked away into the dark and the cold, and she went upstairs and found no blanket outside her door this night, and understood that this was because things had changed, and the communication no longer needed to happen in that oblique and careful way, and she pressed her hand to her mouth and smiled at the empty hallway for a moment before she went inside. Courting Abraham Atkins was, she discovered, a deeply satisfying occupation. He was thoughtful in the way of someone for whom thoughtfulness was not performance, but habit, a way of moving through the world that had become simply who he was. He brought her things when he came to town, never expensive or showy, but always specific and chosen. A book he had borrowed from someone at the ranch that he thought she would like, a jar of good honey from a farm outside town, because she had mentioned once that she missed the honey her mother kept bees for, a small bundle of dried wildflowers that someone had pressed and kept over the summer, and that he had seen in the general store and thought of her. She kept the flowers in the windowsill of her room, and Mrs. Hatch saw them one morning and said nothing, but had a particular expression that said more than nothing. On the Saturdays when the weather was bearable they went for longer walks, out past the edge of town, where the land opened up into the grassland that in summer would be sea-green and waving, but in winter was a landscape of tremendous austere honesty, silver-gray and spare, and somehow beautiful in the way that difficult things can be beautiful when you are with someone who makes you feel safe. He told her about horses in the way that people talk about things they love, without self-consciousness, with the assumption that she would find it interesting, which she did partly because it was genuinely interesting, and partly because listening to Abraham Atkins talk about something he cared about was an experience that had its own quality entirely apart from the subject matter. He explained the particular challenge of working with a spooked animal, the way fear communicated itself through muscle and breath, the patience required to rebuild trust after it had been damaged. "You treat them like they have reasons," she said. "They do," he said. "Fear is a reason. Pain is a reason. Bad experience is a reason. They aren't different from people in that way." "No," she said thoughtfully. "They are not." She thought sometimes about the ways in which she herself had been spooked, and about the patience he had shown, never pushing, never demanding that she come around faster than she was ready to, simply being steady and available and undemanding while she worked out how much she trusted him. It was the same approach, she realized. And it had worked exactly as well on her as it did on the horses, which was both humbling and exactly right. February was cold and also occasionally wonderful. He came to supper at the boarding house twice, which Mrs. Hatch facilitated with the satisfied air of a woman whose plans have come together correctly. On one occasion, they sat in the parlor after supper and Sadie read aloud from one of her books, a novel she had brought from Missouri, and he sat across from her and listened with the total attention he gave to things he considered important. And at one point she looked up from the page and found him watching her face rather than staring into the middle distance as people generally did when being read to. and she lost her place in the sentence and had to find it again, which took longer than it should have because her focus was not entirely on the page. The children at the school had, in the uninhibited way of children, noticed that their teacher appeared to be in a more sustained good humor than she had been in the autumn, and Tommy Brecker had asked her one afternoon, with the magnificent directness of 11-year-olds, whether she had a beau, and she had told him that it was not his concern and he should attend to his sums, and he had said she must have a beau then, because only beau having made grown-ups that cheerful. And she had kept her face serious with considerable effort. March came in with weather that could not make up its mind between winter and spring, warm one day and bitter the next, the land trying on the new season and then changing its mind, the way people did when they were on the edge of something significant and were not quite ready to step forward into it. It was in the second week of March that Abraham asked her to walk with him after church on Sunday, which she did, and he took her out to the eastern edge of town, where the land rose slightly into a gentle swell that gave you a view across the prairie in all directions, and the sky was enormous and clear in the particular way it got in Kansas in the good days, a blue so absolute it seemed personal. They stood there for a moment in the wind, which was mild enough today to be pleasant rather than punishing, and she could see for what felt like forever, the land rolling away from them in every direction, tawny and enormous and full of the strange promise that the plains carried in themselves, the sense that anything was possible in a place this large. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Then tell me," she said. He turned to face her. His eyes in that light were the blue of the sky behind him, and she had the slightly vertiginous feeling that she was looking at something she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since I watched you walk out of the general store in October with your arms full of school supplies, and your coat not warm enough, and your chin up like you dared the cold to do its worst." He said it steadily, as he said everything, but underneath the steadiness was something deep and sure and not performative at all. "I know you've had reason to be careful, and I know I am not a man with a great deal to offer in material terms, but I can tell you that there is not a thing in this world I take as seriously as I would take you, and I would ask nothing of you that you were not fully willing to give." The wind moved across the grassland. A hawk turned lazy circles somewhere above them. The whole wide landscape spread itself out around them and was, in that moment, exactly the right size for what was happening inside her chest. "Abraham," she said. "Yes. I have been in love with you since the green blanket," she said. "The forest green one, November." He looked at her for a moment in which something in his face opened completely, every guard and every held breath released at once. And she stepped forward and he opened his arms and she walked into them, and his arms came around her and pulled her close, and she felt his chin rest on the top of her head, and she closed her eyes. They stood there on the swell of ground with the sky above them and the prairie all around them and the wind moving over the grass like a benediction, and she thought that she had been right about both things simultaneously. Coming west had been brave, and it had been foolish, and it had been, in the end, exactly the right thing, and she would not change a single piece of it. Not the cold, not the thin quilt, not the month of mysterious blankets outside her door, not any of it. "I should like to marry you," he said into her hair. "I should like that too," she said into his coat. They walked back to town hand in hand, which was a public statement of some significance in Caldwell, Kansas in March of 1879, and the first person they passed was Mrs. Hatch coming out of the dry goods store, who looked at their joined hands and then at their faces and then said, "Well, it's about time," with the satisfaction of a woman whose read of the situation had been correct from the beginning. The preparations for a wedding in a small western town in 1879 were not complicated affairs, but they were genuine ones, organized through community and good will more than ceremony and expense, and Sadie found the whole business considerably more pleasant than she had expected, having organized the previous attempt at a wedding from a position of increasing dread that she had at the time mistaken for nerves. This time, there were no nerves. There was a great deal of happiness, and occasional bouts of the pleasant dizziness of someone who is getting more good things than she had stopped expecting and has not yet fully recalibrated, but nerves were not among them. She wrote to her mother with the news. Her mother's letter in reply arrived 3 weeks later and was longer than any letter she had received from her mother in years, full of questions about Abraham and about Caldwell and about the school, and at the end of it was a passage that said, "Your father and I want you to be happy above everything else, and it sounds as though you are. That is all a mother can truly ask for." Sadie read that passage 3 times and then folded the letter very carefully and put it in the small box she kept under her bed, where she stored things she intended to keep. She told Abraham about it that evening, and he listened and then said, "She will come to love Kansas." "She has not been here," Sadie said. "Bring her then," he said, "when things are settled." The things that needed settling were these. Abraham had been saving money since his first wages as a ranch hand and had more set aside than most people guessed, partly because he lived simply and spent carefully, and partly because he had been working towards something without knowing exactly what it was until now. The Rocking H's owner, a man named Calvin Hargrave, who was fair-minded and respected good work, had told Abraham the previous autumn that there was a parcel of land adjacent to the ranch that he intended to sell, and that if Abraham was interested, he had first right of refusal. Abraham was interested. He had been interested since October, which was around the time his thoughts about the future had begun to take a specific direction involving a woman with a determined chin and an insufficient coat. The parcel was 80 acres, with a creek running through the southern portion, and a stand of cottonwood trees that provided shelter from the north wind, and a site where a house could be built with good drainage and a view that on clear days was worth looking at. The price was not unreasonable. Abraham's savings, combined with a loan arranged through the local bank on the strength of Calvin Hargrave's endorsement, covered it. He took Sadie out to see it on a warm Saturday in late April when the grass was beginning to come back green, and the cottonwoods were leafing out in that pale, fresh green that was one of Kansas's gifts to people who had endured its winters. She stood in the middle of what would be their land and turned slowly in a circle, taking in the creek and the trees and the long view west, and her heart was so full she could feel it pressing against her ribs. "This is ours," she said. "This is ours," he said. She reached out and took his hand without looking at him, still looking at the land, and he folded his hand around hers, and they stood there together in the April sunshine, and the wind moved over the new grass, and everything was, in that moment, exactly right. They were married in June of 1879, in the church on the main street of Caldwell, on a Saturday afternoon that was warm without being cruel and sunny, with a sky like a gift. Sadie wore the dress she had altered from the best fabric she could find in Mrs. Kellen's dry goods store, a deep blue that was as close as she could get to the color of those eyes she had come to know the way she knew her own name, Mrs. Hatch sat in the front pew and produced a handkerchief at the appropriate moment. Tommy Brecker, who had come with his family, made a face at the kissing portion of the ceremony, and then asked loudly afterward whether there would be cake, which there was. Abraham stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him down the aisle with an expression that she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life, as if he were watching something he had been hoping for and had finally learned to truly believe in, and she felt the same thing reflected back from her own chest as she walked toward him, sure-footed on the wooden floor in her good shoes, certain in a way she had never been certain about anything before. The minister read the words, and they said the words, and Abraham placed on her finger a plain gold band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita, simple and well-made and exactly right, and she looked down at it on her hand, and then up at his face, and everything that needed to be understood was understood. They had supper that evening at the restaurant on First Street, the same table where they had sat in December, and Mrs. Hatch and Calvin Hargrave and his wife and a few others who had become friends filled in around them, and there was food and good conversation, and one excellent bottle of wine that Calvin had produced from somewhere with the air of a man who had been waiting for a suitable occasion. After supper, they went home. Home was, for the time being, a small house on the edge of town that Abraham had rented while the house on their land was being built. It was not large and it was not elegant, but it was clean and it had a fireplace and a proper bed and a kitchen table. And when they came through the door on their wedding night, Sadie looked around at all of it and felt the specific satisfaction of a woman who is exactly where she is supposed to be. On the bed, folded with the neat precision she recognized, was the very first blanket, the dark red plaid one, the one that had appeared outside her door in October. She stood looking at it for a moment and then looked at Abraham, who was standing in the doorway of the small bedroom with his hat in his hands. "You kept it," she said. "It seemed like it ought to come with us," he said. She sat down on the edge of the bed and put her hand on the wool, and the feeling that moved through her then was too large and too complete to be called by any single name. It was everything at once: the October cold and the warmth of the blanket, and the month of mystery, and the conversation at the livery fence and the January street, and the March hill and the April land and the June altar, and all of it layered together into something she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for. "Come here," she said, and he came, and that was how their life together began in earnest. Building the house on their 80 acres took most of the summer and into the autumn. Abraham did a great deal of the work himself, with help from ranch hands from the Rocking H who came on their off days, and a neighbor named Jonas Fields who had lived in the area for a decade, and knew the land and the building requirements for surviving Kansas winters with any comfort. Sadie contributed what she could, and was useful in the ways she understood and learned the ways she didn't. And she had opinions about windows and the placement of the kitchen which she expressed clearly, and which Abraham took seriously and incorporated into the plans. The house that resulted was not large, but it was solid, with thick walls and good insulation, and a fireplace in the main room that drew well and a kitchen stove that was the pride of the operation. The windows faced south and east to catch the light, and there was a porch across the front where you could sit in the evenings and watch the light change over the grassland, which was one of the particular pleasures of the Kansas plains for anyone who had learned to see it. Sadie continued teaching through all of this. The school board had been happy to renew her contract, and Grundy had given her a slight increase in wages with the air of a man doing something generous while being careful not to make it look too generous. She walked the mile and a half into town in the mornings and back in the evenings, except on the coldest days when Abraham drove her in the wagon, which he did without comment and without requiring her to ask. She also had begun, in the evenings after marking papers, to sew. She had not been a particularly avid seamstress before, but something about the domesticity of their house and the practical requirements of setting up a home from nearly nothing had awakened an interest she had not known was there, and she found it satisfying in the way that all genuinely useful things are satisfying. She was sewing one evening in early October, with the fireplace lit and the house warm around her and Abraham cleaning a piece of tack at the kitchen table, when she looked up at him in the ordinary way that she looked at him sometimes when she wanted to simply see him, and she thought about the previous October, herself cold and alone and carefully hopeful in Mrs. Hatch's drafty room, and how entirely different the world looked from where she was sitting now. "Abraham," she said. He looked up. "I think we're going to have a baby," she said. He set down what he was holding with great deliberateness. He looked at her. She watched the news travel through him from his face to his hands to the straightening of his spine, and then he was across the room and she was in his arms and he held her with the careful fierceness of a man who understood that he was holding something precious. "When?" he said into her hair. "April, I think," she said. He pulled back to look at her face, and what was in his expression was so wholly and completely everything she had come to love about him, the steadiness and the depth and the total absence of performance, just genuine feeling moving across his face like weather across the open land. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am wonderful," she said, and meant it without qualification. Their son was born on the 14th of April, 1880, on a day when the prairie was coming back to green, and the cottonwoods along the creek were putting out their first pale leaves. The birth was managed with the help of a competent and calm woman named Ada, who served as Caldwell's midwife, and who Abraham had ridden to fetch in the very early hours of the morning, with a speed that suggested he had been quietly preparing for this for some time. Sadie was not frightened, which surprised her slightly. She was tired and she was in considerable pain and she was absolutely focused, and Abraham was there, which she had not expected to be as important as it was, but his presence was the thing she held onto through the long hours, the steadiness of him in the room, the fact that he did not leave. When it was done and the morning had given way to afternoon and the baby was here, red-faced and shouting his objections to the cold and the light with impressive volume, Sadie held him against her chest and felt something in her heart that she had no precedent for and did not need a name for and intended to feel every day for the rest of her life. "Hello," she told him quietly. "I have been waiting for you." Abraham sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at their son with an expression that she would always remember, bare and overflowing, and not for a moment trying to be anything other than what it was. "What shall we call him?" she asked. Abraham had a thought he had been keeping. "Henry," he said, "my father's name." "Henry Atkins," she said, tasting it. "That's a good name." "Henry Thomas Atkins," Abraham said. "Thomas was your grandfather's name." She looked at him. He had asked her about her grandfather only once months ago, and she had said the name once in passing, and he had remembered. She was not surprised. She was simply, again, moved by the quality of his attention, the particular care he took with everything she told him, the way nothing she said was treated as inconsequential. "Henry Thomas Atkins," she confirmed, and the baby chose this moment to yawn enormously and close his eyes, apparently satisfied with the decision. They settled into the life of three with the same steady attentiveness they had brought to everything else. Sadie took the summer off from teaching and spent it in the particular and demanding engagement of learning what Henry needed and how to provide it, and Abraham came home from his work at the ranch every evening without fail, and took the baby with a confidence that she found almost indecent in someone encountering this particular experience for the first time. "You're good at this," she told him one evening. "He's not that different from a nervous horse," Abraham said, which she found both absurd and entirely true. She returned to teaching in September, leaving Henry in the capable and increasingly fond supervision of a young woman named Pearl Dawson, who lived nearby, and had decided that caring for the Atkins baby was preferable to any of the other available employment in Caldwell, a decision that Henry's very good nature made easy to maintain. The school year of 1880 into 1881 was, in Sadie's professional opinion, the best one she had yet taught. She had her feet fully under her now. She knew the families, she knew the rhythms of the town, and she had a depth of personal understanding about what it meant to start over in a hard place and find something worth holding onto that informed everything she brought into that single room and offered to the 14, and then 16, and then 18 children who came to learn what she had to teach. Tommy Brecker had aged out of her school and was working on his father's farm, but he still came by occasionally to say hello in the way of a young person who wants to demonstrate that he has grown, but also wants to see a familiar face, and she was always glad to see him. Life on the ranch parcel was good in all the genuine ways that good things are good, not smooth or effortless or free of difficulty, because nothing worth having is those things, but solid and real and built on a foundation that had been laid carefully and with intention. Abraham's arrangement with Calvin Hargrave had evolved over the year into something more like partnership than employment. He ran a string of horses on the 80 acres, and was developing a reputation in the area for the quality of the animals he could work with and train, which was both satisfying for its own sake and useful in the practical sense of providing an income that grew steadily. He also, without making any announcement about it, continued to be the man who noticed when people needed things and provided them without making a production of it. Sadie watched him do this repeatedly over the months and years, and it never stopped striking her, this habit of attention, this way of seeing what was needed and simply meeting it. He left wood on the porch of an elderly man who lived alone up the road. He helped a young family who had come west from Oklahoma Territory get their wagon repaired when they broke down on the road past the ranch. He was not a man who put his kindness into words, and he was not a man who expected acknowledgement for it, which meant he received a great deal of acknowledgement because people trusted him in the way you trust someone whose consideration of you is not conditional. She loved him for many things, and she loved him especially for this. In the spring of 1882, they were in the kitchen after supper, the dishes done and Henry asleep in his room where he now slept through the night, with the reliability of a person who has decided that sleeping through the night is simply how things are done. And Sadie was reading and Abraham was reviewing a letter from the man who had inquired about purchasing 2 of the horses, when she looked up and said, "I believe we are doing this again." He looked up. "April again," she said, which was not quite right. It would be May, she thought, but April was close enough for the poetry of it. This time he put the letter down very slowly and came around the table and pulled her into his arms without a word, and held her for a long time in the warm kitchen with the fire burning and the prairie dark and quiet outside, and she could feel the steadiness of him against her back and the evenness of his breathing, and was suffused with the absolute rightness of it. Their daughter arrived on the 3rd of May, 1883, which was later than the calculation had suggested, but children have their own schedules. She came into the world with less objection than Henry had, and looked around with large dark eyes that would remain dark, unlike her brother whose eyes had settled into a blue very much like his father's. "Clara," Sadie said. Abraham, who had been keeping very quiet and very present at the head of the bed, said, "After Mrs. Hatch." "It seems right," Sadie said. "She was the first kindness of this place." Abraham went to the boarding house the following day to inform Mrs. Hatch. He came back with the information that Mrs. Hatch had received the news with great composure, and then had immediately begun crying and produced her handkerchief. She came to visit the following Sunday with a gift she had been crocheting for months, and which she handed to Sadie with the expression of a woman who has been proven spectacularly correct about something she believed in from the beginning. "You were right," Sadie told her, with the baby Clara in her arms. "I usually am," Mrs. Hatch said, with enormous and entirely justified satisfaction. Henry, at 3 years old, approached the question of a sister with philosophical detachment that gradually converted to possessive affection over the course of several weeks. And by the time Clara was a month old, he had appointed himself her primary protector, a role he took seriously, and that Abraham watched with a quiet pleasure that Sadie saw every time he looked at the 2 of them together. The years in Kansas formed themselves into a life that she could not have imagined when she arrived cold and alone in October of 1878, and yet that felt, in its finished form, exactly inevitable, the way that all true things feel inevitable once you can see them clearly. The land they had bought and built on became in the deepest sense home, not the place she had come from or the place she had tried to make home before, but the specific and irreplaceable terrain of her actual life, known in the way that only living something fully can make you know it. The school continued. She taught for years, watching children grow up and leave and sometimes come back, watching the town of Caldwell change as the cattle trade changed, as the railroad shifted things, as families came and went, and the prairie asserted itself over whatever people tried to impose on it. She watched with both eyes open, which was the only way she knew to be in the world, and she found that there was always something worth seeing. Abraham's horse operation grew. He was known throughout the region by the mid-1880s as someone whose animals were sound and well-trained, and whose word was reliable, and the combination of those things meant that he never lacked for work or for buyers. He expanded the parcel, bought another 40 acres to the north, built a proper stable that was a substantial step up from the working shed they had started with. He was in his element, doing work he was genuinely good at in a place he loved, and the satisfaction of it was something Sadie saw in him every day, the particular quality of a person who has found the life that fits them. They argued sometimes, as genuine people do. They disagreed about money, and about how much time the children spent on their schoolwork, and about the dog that Henry acquired in 1886 without asking, and that turned out to be not one dog but the advance party of 4 dogs, as its puppies arrived 6 weeks later. Sadie was not in favor of 4 dogs. Abraham was quietly and completely in favor of 4 dogs, and had the skill to not say so directly while making it entirely clear where he stood, and the dogs stayed, which Sadie could not ultimately argue with because they were excellent dogs and Henry was wild with love for them. She forgave him for the dogs. There were harder things, too. A winter in 1885 that was brutal even by Kansas standards, during which they lost 2 horses and spent weeks genuinely worried about the cattle and about whether the roof would hold, and it held, and they came through it together in the way that they came through everything, with the accumulated weight of 6 years of genuine partnership behind them, knowing how the other person operated under pressure and trusting it entirely. There was a period in 1887 when Abraham hurt his shoulder badly in a fall from a horse and could not work at full capacity for 3 months, and Sadie watched him struggle with this. A man so physically capable and so accustomed to being useful reduced to a limited range of motion and dependence on others. And she found every resource she had of patience and practicality and love, and deployed them without comment or ceremony. Simply being what he needed with the same quiet understanding he had shown her when she arrived cold and proud, and refusing to ask for anything. He recovered fully. He told her afterward, during one of the long conversations they had in the evenings after the children were in bed, that those months had been among the most difficult of his life and also among the most instructive. "How so?" she asked. "I learned how to let someone take care of me," he said. "That is not a thing that comes naturally." "I know," she said and smiled. He caught the smile and returned it, the slow, full one that still, a decade on, did something to her equilibrium when she saw the whole of it. Henry started school in the fall of 1886, at 6 years old, in the same schoolroom that his mother taught. Sadie had some concerns about this arrangement, specifically about the challenge of being his teacher and his mother simultaneously, without either role being compromised. Abraham's position on the matter was that Henry was a sensible child and would manage it, and Henry proved this by treating his mother at school with the formal respect he gave to no one at home, and treating her at home with the cheerful disregard he gave to no one at school. And this dual performance was so exact and so consistent that Sadie eventually concluded it was not performance at all but simply Henry's genuine understanding of context, which was one of his better qualities and clearly inherited from his father. Clara, when she started school 2 years later, had a different approach, which was to treat every person in every context with the same warm directness regardless of their relationship to her, and this turned out to work equally well for entirely different reasons. Sadie watched her children grow with the particular amazement of parents everywhere, the sense that the fact of them was always slightly staggering no matter how accustomed you became to their presence. Henry grew tall like his father and quiet like his father, and had his grandfather's name and something of his grandmother's scholarly temperament, that restless appetite for knowledge that Sadie recognized from the descriptions Abraham had given of his mother. Clara was vibrant and capable and had opinions that she was not shy about expressing, and she could ride a horse almost as well as Abraham by the time she was 7, which was an accomplishment that Abraham regarded with an extremely well-managed pride. It was in 1888, when Sadie and Abraham had been on the land for almost a decade, that Sadie's mother finally came west to visit. Her name was Margaret Sawyer, and she was a small, precise woman from Missouri with her daughter's same tendency toward holding herself very straight, and her daughter's same quality of refusing to admit when she was nervous. She arrived in Caldwell on the train in June, and Abraham met her at the depot with the wagon, which was polished and had a cushion on the seat that was not usually there, and he handed her up with the courteous ease of a man who is confident in his welcome and does not need to impress anyone. Margaret Sawyer looked at Abraham Atkins for a long moment before she allowed herself to be handed into the wagon. She was a mother who had worried about her eldest daughter for years, had felt guilty about the inadequacy of her comfort when Gerald Holt had done what he had done, had watched Sadie go west with terror disguised as maternal concern, and then gradually, through years of cheerful letters and reliable news, and the accumulating evidence of a daughter who was not just surviving but genuinely flourishing, had converted that terror into something closer to proud bewilderment. She looked at Abraham and she saw a man who was at ease in the place he was standing, who had clean hands and steady eyes, and who had met her without ceremony and with the manner of someone for whom the occasion was simply a pleasant one, not an audition. "Mr. Atkins," she said. "Mrs. Sawyer," he said. "Welcome to Kansas." "Thank you," she said, and then with the precision that was the family characteristic, "My daughter is happy." "She is," he said. "I intend to keep it that way." Margaret Sawyer allowed herself to be handed into the wagon and said nothing else for the first mile of road, which was her version of a verdict. By the end of the week she had met Henry and Clara and the 4 dogs and Mrs. Hatch and Calvin Hargrave, and had sat on the porch in the evening and watched the light change over the grassland, and had talked with Sadie for 3 long evenings in a row about everything that had happened in the decade since Missouri. And on the last evening before she left, she took Sadie's hands in both of her own and looked at her for a long moment. "I was so frightened when you went," she said. "I know," Sadie said. "I thought you were running away." "I was," Sadie said, "and I was also running toward." Her mother looked at her with the expression of a woman who has come a long way to understand something she could not have understood from a distance. "He is a good man," she said. "Not what I imagined for you. Better." "Yes," Sadie said simply. When Margaret Sawyer left on the eastbound train, she leaned out of the window and Sadie saw that she was smiling in a way she had not seen on her mother's face in years. And she waved until the train curved, and the window was no longer visible. And then she turned back to Abraham, who was standing with Clara on his arm and Henry beside him, and the 4 dogs at everyone's feet because they had come into town and were making the most of the outing. She walked back to her family, and Abraham put his free arm around her shoulders, and they walked together back through Caldwell, through the main street she had walked into cold and alone in October of 1878, and now walked through as someone who knew it the way you know something you are part of, not just familiar with but genuinely belonging to. They drove home in the evening light, Henry talking about something he had seen in town, Clara asleep against Abraham's arm, the dogs in the back of the wagon in a happy pile. The land spread out around them in the golden horizontal light of June, and the cottonwoods along the creek of their land were full and green, and the house sat in its place on the gentle rise, as if it had always been there, which it had not, but which was a kind of truth anyway, because some things only feel inevitable in retrospect and feel all the more true for it. That night after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Sadie went to the chest at the foot of their bed and opened it. Inside, folded with the careful precision that was entirely his, were the blankets. She had kept them all. The dark red plaid that had started everything, the blue one that had come the second week, the cream with the dark stripes, the forest green that she had pressed her face into in November and known, even while she was not yet willing to name it, what was happening to her. She lifted out the dark red plaid and unfolded it and held it in her hands, and Abraham came in from checking on the children and saw what she was holding and stopped in the doorway. I was just thinking, she said. About, he said. About October, she said. 1878. Standing in the cold in front of this thing and having absolutely no idea, she smiled. About how you saw that I was cold and didn't ask and just made it better. He crossed the room and took the blanket from her hands and settled it around her shoulders, the way he had done 1,000 times in all the years between then and now, and she reached up and held the edges of it together under her chin and looked up at him. You have been making things better since October 1878, she said. You have been making things worth making better, he said. She reached up and touched his face with one hand, the way she did sometimes when she simply needed to feel that he was real and present and hers, and she was his. And he turned his face slightly into her hand the way he always did, this large, quiet, capable man who had never needed to be anything other than what he was. They stayed together on their land through all the years that followed, through the changes that came to Kansas in the late 1880s and into the 1890s, through the shifts in the cattle trade as the open range gave way to fenced pastures, and the great drives ended, and the West changed its character from wild to something more settled, through years of good rain and years of drought, and the ordinary, extraordinary passage of days that constitute a life lived genuinely. Henry grew into a young man who combined his father's patience with his mother's intellectual hunger, and eventually went east to study, and wrote letters home that made both of them proud in ways they found difficult to articulate and did not try too hard to, understanding that some pride is best carried quietly. Clara stayed closer, the way she always had been closer to the land and to the horses, and married a farmer from the neighboring county at 21, who Abraham approved of after careful observation and Sadie approved of after one conversation, and they settled within riding distance, which was exactly what everyone involved had hoped for. The grandchildren came in the course of time, and Sadie found in them yet another version of the staggering fact of continuity, the way that love keeps producing its evidence, keeps showing up in new faces and voices, and the particular curl of a question asked by someone who has just discovered the world and cannot get enough of it. She taught until she chose to stop, which was not because she had to, but because the moment came when she knew she had given what she had to give to that particular calling, and it was time for someone else's turn, and she stepped aside with the same cleanness she had stepped forward with, and the school board thanked her with genuine feeling, and a ceremony that she bore with as much grace as she could manage, and Abraham attended with a smile that was quiet and proud, and all the way to his eyes. She sat on the porch on an evening in the autumn of 1895, 37 years old, and settled into herself with the particular certainty of a woman who has chosen well and knows it, and watched the light go from the sky over the prairie in layers of gold and amber and rose, and Abraham came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat down beside her. And neither of them said anything for a while because they had long since discovered that their silences were as good as their conversations, and sometimes better. The cottonwoods along the creek moved in the evening wind. A hawk made its last circle of the day and banked away toward the east. Somewhere in the pasture one of the horses called out once and was quiet. "I have been thinking," Abraham said. She said. "About that first winter," he said. "How cold it was." She turned her head and looked at him. The lines around his eyes were deeper now, and his hair had silver in it, and he was altogether the most beautiful person she had ever seen, not despite the evidence of years but made more himself by it. "Do you remember the green blanket?" she asked. "I told you once that was when I knew November." "I remember," he said. "I was lying," she said. He looked at her with a question. "I knew from the first one," she said. "October, the red plaid. I told myself I didn't because I was being careful, but I knew." He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and his fingers closed around hers in the way they had closed around hers 1,000 times in all the years between then and now, sure and warm and not going anywhere. "I knew before that," he said. "At the general store. Before I ever left the first one. when you walked out with your arms full and your chin up. She looked at the prairie and the dying light, and thought about the long distance between that woman on the train platform and this one on the porch, and about all the ordinary and extraordinary things that had happened in the space between, and about the ways in which a person could have no idea what was coming and then look back and see that it had been coming all along, that it had always been building toward this specific evening, this specific porch, this specific hand in hers. "Thank you," she said, the way she had said it first at the livery fence, meaning something larger than the word could hold, but using it anyway because some things are worth saying even when they fall short of the full truth. "You're welcome," he said, the way he had not said it then, the way he was saying it now, simply and without any reservation whatsoever. The evening settled around them, warm and complete, and the Kansas sky put on the rest of its colors before releasing the night, and they sat together and watched it all the way to the end.